3. Welcome, I'm back, the big brown gadfly, for another episode as we go on our journey through American culture. You'll notice the logo says Tabano de Atenas. That's because I have a Spanish TV show now on Roku. It's on Brighteon TV. You'll have to learn Spanish or watch that show a little bit to know what Tabano de Atenas means. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with Socrates and ancient Athens. But for right now, we're here in America in the 21st century, and I am very pleased to be joined by Dr. Judith Stacey, who is a professor emeritus from New York University. And I was able to contact her. I was very honored that she returned my message. She is a prolific feminist writer and scholar, and she has many articles and books. I've gotten through a lot of them, but I haven't been through all of them because that would take a lot of time. But she is really an expert on the topic of family values and the history of that discourse. And she comes from the field of sociology. I come more from the field of the humanities, but I've always said that sociology is the social science that is closest to the humanities. I think even closer than political science in a lot of ways. And so often when sociologists are talking about an issue, they are also talking about the rhetoric. So that's where I think we have a lot of common ground, and we can talk about that. What I want to talk about today is what happened to family values, and we're going to get to that in a moment. First, I have to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm sorry to bore you with these details, but we've got to sell books at the same time. So the first thing is I want to make you all aware that cancel-proof Christianity it's done. I put the final proofs in. So those of you who pre-ordered it, you can get your final copy in the mail. I know it's been a little bit overdue, but it is a great book that will help you to navigate what is going on, what cancel-proof culture has to do with economic policy, what it has to do with the future of Christian families. And so that book, remember that the subtitle for that book is Stop Complaining and Build Your Own Civilization, which is a theme that I think is important there. So we're going to go now into the topic for today. I'm calling this Whatever Happened to Family Values because that is the title of the book I'm working on, which should be done in a couple of weeks. And it's the story of two words, family and values, two words that are very loaded. And those of you who follow conservative politics, it's almost archaeological. You see family values pop up here and there, but it's not part of the mainstream discourse. And that was what really got me asking the question, what happened to family values? I remember in the 1990s when I was a young man in my 20s and just starting out in life, I was very, very liberal at that time. And I remember family values was the language that people debated about. And in particular, 30 years ago, there was a speech in 1992 that was delivered after the Los Angeles riots by Dan Quayle, in which family values became the centerpiece. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But really the question that I wanted to know was, why is it that the Republicans and conservatives are talking so much about religious liberty? Why, when you have a loaded topic like abortion, we get all of this celebration over a Supreme Court case that doesn't say abortion is murder or even that it's wrong. It just says that according to the Constitution, the states need to have the right to do that. Why did it become an argument over states' rights? That confused me. And then after the abortion decision came down in Dobbs, then Ted Cruz jumped in and started talking about how we have to overturn Obergefell and reverse the trend on gay marriage. And his reason for that was, this is a states' rights issue. And which to me is a little bit disingenuous, because we want to know, what is your stance on homosexuality? If you're against it, just say it and then have a debate, defend your views, and be honest about what it is that is driving this. And then when I looked at all that, I realized that religious liberty is this term that's used to strike at those old positions on personal morality and on family, social status, etc., but without having to actually defend what the moral positions are. So that was how I came to this. And as I started delving into it, my gosh, I feel like Alice in Wonderland. I'm dragged into this world from the past that a lot of people, I think a lot of people who are just entering politics now might not even know about the debate about family values. There were so many shocking things I found that I'm going to go into in the book and in future interviews. But for right now, I want to just give Judith Stacey the opportunity to share her wisdom and her memories of the time period. You know, I just really want to give her a chance to share the history of it. She put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this debate in the 90s. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by going back 30 years ago, last May, to the 30th anniversary of a speech that was delivered at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. And this was a speech by Vice President at the time, Dan Quayle. And I want to make sure that the sound, let me make sure that the sound is going to be shared on this. Oops, see, I didn't click the share sound. That's the key. All right. So we're going to listen to this speech in which Dan Quayle responds to the controversy over the Los Angeles riots by bringing up a TV show starring Candice Bergen. And let's see what became of this speech. And the sound is not coming up. What is going on with the sound again? Oh, there we go. Is the sound coming up? Are you hearing the sound?
No.
Oh gosh, I don't know what is happening. Come on, come on, come on. Where is the sound? Maybe it is. I'm just gonna go headphones. I don't have no idea what. Oh, here we go. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, let's get to the sound, and then here we go.
He told the Commonwealth Club luncheon the LA riots happened because of disintegrating family values.
It doesn't help matters when primetime TV has Murphy Brown, a character who supposedly epitomizes today's intelligent, highly paid professional woman, mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice.
Maybe you overreacted just a hair.
Oh, sure, Alvin, I overreacted. I'm telling you, we get her back in here, we open her first, I guarantee you we find a big baggie filled with iodine. 10 minutes till the next man comes. So if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go upstairs and take a shower. And no one, not even Norman Bates.
Well, there is a little clip. Does that bring back any memories to you, Judith?
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, I think many of your viewers won't know, Murphy Brown was an extremely popular comedy show on TV in which she was an anchor woman, and it was played by Candice Bergen, and she became pregnant and decided to keep the child. So it's kind of interesting that Dan Quayle, who was playing for the right-wing conservative vote, and that was an important part of the politics of political shift in the Republican Party at that time, that he attacked her because instead the other option was to have an abortion. So it's really interesting that he did that. But what he was really doing was drawing on a racial discourse which had started in the 60s, which was about Black families being pathological according to this ideology because of the lack of fathers. And there was an attack on welfare mothers and all of that. And that's what he was really doing, pulling on in LA when he first made the speech. And then when he was in the Commonwealth Club, then he tried to backtrack a little bit. And so he watched the program with a set of Black mothers. So that's part of what was going on in that.
That what happened. That's why they had the footage of him sitting with, oh, okay. So that was the second time he delivered the speech.
Well, that was the second speech. That wasn't the original speech. The original speech was actually in LA.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know that. That's yeah, so informative. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow. And so when you look at that, why did he draw a connection between a show about a white woman who was a celebrity and the Black riots? I mean, was that because one of the things that I go back and forth with, was that a progressive move in a certain sense? Because
no, not at all. No, it was very crafty, and no, there was nothing progressive about it. It was part of an anti-welfare politics, and it was also part of a turn to appeal to the evangelical Christian vote, which was gaining strength at that time, and that was part of the whole. That started with the whole Reagan. It actually started in the 70s. This is such a long, complicated history, so I don't want to bog down in the details. But no, there was nothing progressive about it. What the Republicans did is they seized on the old discourse, which had been about Black families, when it turned out that when Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, had started the critique of the breakdown, so-called breakdown of Black families in the 60s. And but he had done it from a complicated in between liberal and conservative point of view. It was very conservative culturally, but it was liberal politically in that he was in support of welfare provisions, but also work provisions. However, it was and at the time that Moynihan started that campaign, approximately 20% to a fourth of Black families were so-called headed by women. When Dan Quayle gave the speech and the assault on Murphy Brown, it was when white families had reached that number. So in the 1990s, when white families now had approximately 20 to 25% of white families now were so-called fatherless, were headed by single mothers. So this was the alarm bell, and this was the appeal. And it was like, oh my, the destruction of the Black family shows white families their future. It was a deeply, I don't like the word conservative, because to me, conservative is about conserving something. And I think it was really very reactionary. And it was very clever in that regard.
I think it came across to a lot of people as anti-family, because it was anti-individual. Like, there were so many people who were watching that and said, well, I was raised by my mom. This is an attack on me and my family. So in that sense, it was anti-family. Now, but
the notion then, and the argument that continued for a long time and that it got involved in, was that the proper family was the heterosexual married couple, two-parent family. So it was an attack on any family that wasn't that.
Right. Now, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that the Supreme Court case, Casey versus Southeastern Planned Parenthood, or Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania, was debated a month prior to this, and it was decided a month after. So the timing was abominable. And I think one of the conservative camps that really lost out based on this line of reasoning was the pro-life movement, because he basically attacked her and shamed the whole idea of a woman raising a child. And in the show, she kind of becomes unexpectedly pregnant, and the man leaves her. So the only other option she would have had would have been to put the child up for adoption.
Or put it up for adoption, or have an abortion.
And, she decided to raise the child with its biological mother, so he would have that connection, and he would eventually have some contact with his father. Oh my goodness! Well, family values are. That's my son. All right. Well, we'll see. He loves to get involved in stuff. So it really did damage the pro-abortion movement, because at the time, I think the pro-life movement was told that the shift was going to be towards family values, which meant exactly this, that the family had to look a certain way in terms of its structure. It had to be mom and dad, and these were the two parents that were the biological parents for the most part. I think that they were trying to advance adoption, but it really, if you think about how it took 30 years from Casey to get to Dobbs, and from I know that you're probably
your son is playing.
I'm not even.
All right.
All right. Okay. So that's one of the things that is interesting about this. It really leads me to agree with a lot of what you said. I remember in one of the articles that you wrote, you said this is all a ruse. This isn't true. They don't really care about family values. And I think there was one line in one of your articles which was basically like, if they were ever asked to finance what it would take to keep these families intact, which would mean paying a living wage to the husbands, having daycare available, having healthcare insurance available, that they would abandon this in a second. And that is, in fact, what happened. I mean, family values. I think what happened in the 1992 election is the Republicans paid a huge cost for this. That many people feel that this was part of why they lost the election to Bill Clinton. And then the Democrats figured out that they could take the family values discourse back. And you had a lot of criticism about that, didn't you, about when the Democrats were taking it? Now, I want to note that I think the Democrats owned family values first, because the Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford debates made clear that the Democrats could appeal to families and say, look, we care about your moral development and we care about your financial status. And that was very much Jimmy Carter, who was an evangelical. But then that got stripped of the economic part, but in the Reagan era. So Clinton was, in some senses, kind of taking family values back into the Democratic Party, but he was doing it in a way that you had a lot of criticisms of. Like, what were your criticisms of the Democratic move at that time?
Well, my criticisms were that they accepted the assault on welfare. Jimmy Clinton signed the welfare bill. His policy, the new Democratic Leadership Council, was trying to appropriate a lot of the Republican, not just the rhetoric, but some of the policies. And also, you have to remember that Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act against same-sex marriage. That was part of my criticism. That I had other criticisms as well. I also thought some of it was entirely disingenuous. I mean, there was Clinton, the son of a single mother, right? And yet he was saying the same stuff about kids need two parents, and he didn't mean same-sex parents. Now, it wasn't because of a deep ideological belief on his side. It was a political strategy of the Democratic Party that worked at the moment, but I thought would come back to bite them in the end, and I think did.
Yeah, I did. Well, it's interesting because I look at that and I ask myself, what does it take to have a family together? And me, what I just to be honest with you, I had a very traditional perspective. My wife was a stay-at-home mom. I was raising my kids, doing the best that I could. I was working in a Christian seminary, and when I ran afoul of the powers that be in the Baptist world, the way that they would fire people was so brutal and so heartless and so callous. The fact that we didn't have, the fact that we had wives that were not working, that were staying at home, that was really used to control us, because they knew that if we did anything that got out of line and we lost our job, we would have nothing, and the Christian community does not really run to your defense. And they almost on principle, they believe the most important thing is for you to gear up and go out and get another job. So it's like, and then I looked at the divorce statistics, and, if a man gets divorced, the chance that his wife will file, or I'm sorry, when a man loses his job, the chance that his wife will file for divorce like quadruples or something. I mean, that's one of the major reasons. So to me, it just seemed as though if you wanted to keep families together intact in this model, number one, I think it's important for women to have job protections of their own, because if she has an income that's independent of the males, she's not as likely to divorce her husband when the husband loses the job, right? I mean, because they're not going to be fighting about money. That's usually what happens, right? You get home, you're fighting about money, and then your relationship goes sour, and then you broke up. I mean, I was able to keep my family together, but it was a very, very difficult time period. And I just, that's what's so sad to me, is that it seems like both the Democrats and the Republicans kind of are not, they never delivered on the social policies that really could have kept those families together like that. So it just kind of disappeared. I don't know. What is your reading on it? In some ways you were proved right. I think that you were, most of your predictions seem like they're right. Yeah, they came true. Yeah, I mean, what do you say in response to that?
Well, that's a huge question. So make it a little more specific. In response to what? I mean, I had a lot of predictions. So And some
Well,
of them I didn't anticipate. For example, for a long time,
mm,
and now that's turning around again and maybe coming true, the anti-abortion movement and the anti-same-sex marriage were the same. That was all under the rubric of so-called family values. And I always thought that was another example of what was not family values, that it was only valuing one kind of family that was on the decline. And it was on the decline more for economic reasons than it was for ideological reasons. Though, in fact, I wrote early on about how feminism became the fall guy, or took the rap for the so-called declining family, for women's entry into the workforce. But it wasn't feminists that pushed women into the workforce. It was the development of capitalism, the destruction of unions, and the decline of the male breadwinner wage. So that, and also the transformation of American capitalism from manufacturing to a clerical sales and service economy, and ultimately the info economy, so that whenever corporations were free to operate outside of unions, they did, and women were the ideal labor force because they were cheaper and unorganized, and better educated, so and more compliant, they thought. And so for all kinds of reasons that had nothing to do with feminism. But feminism was reemerging at the same time that this was all going on. And also because of the enormous expansion of coeducation in college, which I'm the first generation that benefited from that. I'm old, so I've lived through all of this. So I grew up, I was a teenager in the 50s, so I know what that ideology was, and I know about how dramatic those transformations were in my own life as well, and then ultimately in my ideology. So all of that was going on at the same time, and feminists were, quote unquote, blamed for the destruction of the family because they entered the workforce. Of course, generally they were entering the workforce to save their families.
right. I mean, that's the biggest thing. I mean, coming from the perspective of someone who tried to make it work,
Right.
who didn't. I mean, they're just most women are out there. It's funny because almost every single appeal to women voters, let's just look at this from partisan politics, deals in some way with them wanting to have high quality relationships with partners and with their children. I mean, almost every single policy that you can sell to the Democratic voter base is going to appeal to those things. So family values naturally should be housed, I think, under those economic policies.
But only if you, by what you mean by family values, is support for a variety of kinds of families. If you mean, as it was meant from Moynihan through the Reagan Republicans and the evangelical Christians and the Dan Quayle speech, if by family values you mean what most people at that time meant, which was support only for the heterosexual married couple biological parent model of family, then it's a different story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't. Well,
See, that's what it meant then.
yeah.
That's what I was criticizing. I wasn't an opponent of family values. I mean, I think I have serious family values, but they're progressive family values. They believe in supporting a whole host of different kinds of families by giving them the resources to make their own type of family succeed.
Yeah, and well, it's interesting. I mean, one criticism that has come up, which is so a surprise to me when I saw that there were people who were noting, and a lot of these were coming from the left. They were saying that one of the problems was by rushing to try to make it possible for women to work outside the home, they did give these capitalists, these economic interests, a very a huge labor force. So they depressed the wages, with the labor.
They got the chronology wrong.
Uh-huh.
We're entering that's another long, I mean, we may get off of where you want to go. I mean, you have to go back to World War II and the Rosie the Riveter and the whole draw of women into the workforce so that men could fight overseas. That was when women began to really, again, enter the labor force. And then when the men came back, they were pushed back out, though many of them stayed, but in lesser jobs. And then the 50s was this real conservative ideological shift, really pushing women out. But in the same period, American manufacturing was beginning to the economy was beginning to shift to what we later called a post-industrial economy, and that was drawing women into the labor force.
Right.
Because the corporations wanted a cheaper, more reliable workforce, who weren't unionized, and that was women.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating history. Now, here's my theory of why, on the Republican side, why they abandoned family values. I think that you're right that in the 90s, Clinton and Gingrich kind of met at this somewhat unsavory crossroads, and both of them were kind of using the same rhetoric.
Faustian pack.
It was very social Darwinist,
Yeah.
it was like, everyone needs to tough up and just,
Right.
somehow go out and make money. It was very, up by your bootstraps kind of stuff. But then eventually, I think that the more liberal wing within the Democratic Party did assert itself, and
Yes.
they were attaching the word family to
Right.
more and more economic initiatives. So healthcare, it was
Well, they
going.
began to use the rhetoric of working families. And
Yes,
that
yeah.
was the important shift.
Right. And I think a lot of that it was almost as though Jimmy Carter, a lot of his rhetoric, I think, started coming back
Right.
to that. And I think that what they did was it was very effective because in a lot of debates, what I found was that when the Republicans would bring up family values, Democrats would say, well, are you supporting daycare centers? What about healthcare? What about school
Interrupt you
reform?
there and just give a little piece of history. That's an example. When Nixon was president, the Congress passed for the first time ever a family policy initiative that would give some support to daycare, and Nixon vetoed it.
Oh, okay. Well, now, what year was that? I'm just curious. Was that like in the
Well,
late?
Nixon would have been around 70, somewhere in there, 70, 72. I don't know. I don't remember the year, but just look at, but it was under Nixon that he vetoed the first bill that was passed to give any support at all to to daycare for working parents.
Yeah, well, what I found when I was looking up a lot of the material was that around the 2000s, all of a sudden, because George W. Bush came in and he was all about trying to get these faith-based initiatives. He wanted to counter the Democratic criticism
Right.
by offering all these church-based services, and it was getting very expensive. And actually, there was a real move in the funding in the early 2000s. The donor class wanted to put a lot more money behind libertarian causes.
Yeah.
Right to work, those right to work states. Tort reform was huge. They wanted to reduce liability. All of a sudden, they came up with this states' rights argument on the Constitution, which was, it just doesn't match what the Constitution says. I mean, because they created a federal government in the late 1780s because the Articles of Confederation were so messy, in terms of all these states having these rights. So, one analysis that I found, they looked at the conservative lawyers, and the vast majority of the money among conservative lawyers was going to the libertarian and these corporate causes. I think it was $43 million in legal fees went to defending libertarian and free market principles, and less than 2 million had gone to the pro-life and the religious causes. So it was clear that the shift was moving there, but they still needed the voters. And so religious liberty, which prior to that, conservatives had rejected because that was Indians smoking peyote. And it was one of the early Supreme Court cases where Seventh-day Adventists who wanted to get unemployment benefits, even though they were turning jobs where they would have to work on Saturday. And conservatives were against that. So Catholics were not fans of religious liberty because that evoked memories of Martin Luther and all these things. And so the religious liberty argument really, I think, came as a way to try to salvage that socially conservative base and then unload the liability that came with the family values discourse, because families require a lot of investment and you have to protect.
The Republicans were never going to invest in families, never, because they were never going to support the economic policies that make family life viable. They never have, they never will.
Yeah. Well, it has been such a treasure to be able to talk to you and to hear what you said about that. Do you agree with my assessment of why the Republicans?
Well, it's really interesting. I'd have to give it a lot of thought. I think it's very provocative and interesting, and I hadn't followed that history, and I don't even know some of the cases that you were referring to. my gut feeling, or my, top of the head reaction, is that the Republican Party, until very recently, has always been dominated by the corporate, which became the neoliberal. I mean, that is the old free market, the Samuelson economics, all of that. So that they were only using the family values discourse to build power in a long range. It was an unholy alliance between religious evangelicals and conservative Catholic Church at one point, and the real power behind the then Republican Party, which were the corporate elite, what later became neoliberals. So I don't think it's that they once believed in family values and then they shifted to religious liberty. And I think they tried to hold on to that alliance. And again, this is top of my head. I haven't given this any thought before, but I think they gave them their base enormous. Just look, we don't have a democracy. We have not ever had a democracy in the sense of majority rule. We have a constitution that disproportionately gives rights to states that have the least population, and the electoral college. So we could go on. And that is because the Constitution was a compromise between slave states and non-slave states, and counting Black people as 3/5 of a person, but not with the right to vote, et cetera. So we have a heavy legacy to overcome in that regard. So I think that what they did is they gave the evangelicals and the true family values believers of the sort I was earlier describing victories around issues like abortion and prayer in school and things like that, by using states' rights arguments so that they could take back that issue. So I think that was how they held on to that alliance. But they never gave a fig. I mean, we certainly know Trump. The most horrendous irony of all, the paradox, is that this guy who has, in my opinion, no values whatsoever and no ideology of any sort other than his own narcissistic need for power, and who can't believe in any fact that he doesn't create, that he would be a symbol of family values. I mean, it's just pretty, and then embrace the anti-abortion. I mean, this guy who we can't even count how many women he's gotten pregnant, we can't count how many women he has abused, et cetera, non-disclosure agreement. So that the irony to me is that became the alliance that took over the judicial system with disproportionately, which the public does not support, as we saw in Kansas this very week.
Yeah. Well, it's a very, very interesting, very rich history. I did want to, before I let you go, we only have about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
I did want to ask you, what would you do if you were the goddess of sociological things?
Oh, well, that's a long other story. And
you wrote an essay once where you said you're a fan of public sociology, right?
Absolutely.
Like, okay, so things like this, that what we're doing is good, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Totally believe in it.
Okay, and then why do you think the Academy took such a dim view of people going out and sharing their research with the public outside of that cosseted little league of scholars?
Well, I don't know that it takes a dim view, but it's always suspicious of popularity and celebrity, or it used to be. The university is an elitist institution, and it usually just speaks to itself and then indirectly influences policy through this more laborious. It was caught off guard by the internet and by social media. We all are, I think, to some extent, and are still barely absorbing the dramatic changes in the world. I mean, I am an old woman, and so I am the person, I grew up before there. I mean, I was the first generation of children to which TV was introduced. There were no TVs before that. I typed my dissertation on a manual typewriter. I mean, it's all the changes in my lifetime are staggering. And so I think we're always playing catch up, and technological change has gone at warp speed now. And so I think that people really haven't absorbed the impact and the change. So what is public sociology in a world where people don't believe in facts anymore, where we don't have a common discourse, where everyone's in their own tunnels and listening and believing what they want to believe? So the university, we really do believe in careful research, documentation, fact checking, responses, and rarely write to a huge public. We usually write to an educated elite.
It seems to me too, because I've spoken to you about this offline. In all the research that I did, I just dove into all of these articles, and like your writing is it's so much fun to read, even if I don't necessarily agree with everything.
Yeah.
It's so well written, and it just it appeals to people. And you just don't have that after about 2005. It's just lots of dense theorization, even when they're talking about the hot button issues.
Right.
They use these very heavy jargon terms, and I get the sense as though to move up in the system, they have to write to that,
or they think they have to. I mean, in other words, yes, people often will finally come to their senses a little bit later, but yeah, the pressure to publish and to get into certain journals, and then the people who are controlling, so it becomes this hermetic circle. So that was part of the Goddess of Sociological Things. I was writing about the discipline, not only of sociology, but of the university in general. And I was saying, it was kind of Swiftian. I was saying a modest proposal, like if I were the czar, I would tell scholars they weren't allowed to publish anything every third year.
Yeah, well, I have to go because we're going to be cut off by Zoom.
Okay.
But thank you so much. I'll put links to these articles for readers, and I look forward to everyone to talk to you next week. Thank you so much, Dr. Judith Stacey. I'm gonna see. I'll try to stay in touch. So
Great.
thank you so much
Good
for
luck
everything.
with your book.
Oh, thank